so what I'm going to do today, I'm going to provide some context of how the situation of precarity that we're in today. I'm going to levy an indictment on my profession, economics. I'm going to talk about some alternative ways in which we can expand the way economists think about some of these issues. I'm going to talk about some of the health implications of the rhetoric around work hard, study hard, particularly for subaltern groups. And then finally, I'm going to list some policies that are bold initiatives that I think could provide that could bring us into a new realm of an economic Bill of Rights to fulfill a more better union. Some policies that I've been talking a lot about with my colleague, William Darrick, two in particular are federal job guarantee, and the other is a baby bond program, which is a substantial child trust program. And what I have up here are some slides that demonstrate some of the vivid descriptive inequities along racial lines that are prevalent, but I may or may not get to them, or they might come together in question and answers. So let me begin. And I'm okay with clarifying questions or interruptions. I'm fine with that. All right. So across the globe, people live in environments of reinforcing inequalities, vulnerabilities, and obstacles to social mobility and political inclusion. The list of despair includes wealth and income disparity, unemployment, underemployment, exposure to economic disparity, exposure to economic downturns, income, work hour, expense volatility, vulnerability to predatory finance that results from budgetary shortfalls, a lack of financial cushion, a shift from corporate and government social insurance to household and individual private insurance. One could see the work of Jacob Hacker, for example. Intergenerational transfers of affluence and poverty, increasing demands for care work and in vivo transfer to less well-off family members and friends, wealth stripping from municipal fees, fines, debt, so that municipalities may balance local budgets, mass incarceration, food insecurity, environmental injustice, and vulnerability to climate fluctuations and natural disaster, dream hoarding, where, as described by Richard Reeves, the rich and upper middle class are hoarding all the economic gains from the past 40 years to benefit themselves and their children, and to translate those gains into better schools and eventually better jobs, right? So in Richard Reeves' book, he expands the narrative of the demonized top 1% to talk about the professional class in general, and he and I dare say that some of those might be in the room today, okay? And then finally, the physical and mental harm resulting from social, psychological stress via stigma, stereotype threat, overexertion, implicit bias, and micro and macro aggressions. So these vulnerabilities are more pronounced for economically marginalized and socially stigmatized groups. The vulnerabilities disproportionately fall on women, blacks, and other non-whites. Their education, employment, and earnings are more precarious, and they tend to have more caregiving and financial responsibilities than their peers. The popular French economist Thomas Piketty characterizes the growing worldwide context of structural inequality as largely locked in at birth as a result of laws, policies, institutions, and economic arrangement. It is in this context in which the Reverend Dr. William Barber, a leader of the Moral Mondays movement, proclaims that economic justice is a moral imperative. In this vein, we need to reassess how we measure societal economic health and emphasize economic empowerment and social inclusion to address our daunting problems in structural inequality, which I highlighted above. We need to prioritize economic equity, fairness, and what the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen calls human capabilities, where we measure our national economic health by how well we enable all our citizens to attain their self-defined goals. The term political economist has become an albatross, as if the field is somehow scientifically weaker and less objective than plain old economics. One need not sacrifice rigor to study how institutions and behaviors intertwine with an objective, of building economic inclusion. Likewise, we all need to recognize that scholarship rooted in norms, especially scholarship that claims to study production, transaction, and distribution, all has some normative perspective. The dogma that markets are simply natural, transparent, efficient, and inevitable leads to a false notion of fairness, that somehow if each individual is free to pursue their own profit and happiness, then that will ultimately lead to the greater good for society. Markets, whether they're product markets, labor markets, or financial markets, are all presumed to be self-regulating. The most astute, the most valued, and the hardest workers are believed to prosper and endure, while the least astute, the least valued, and the laziest are presumed to receive their just rewards and simply fade away or have to find something else to do over time. These presumptions pay little attention to the roles of power and initial capital, and how that power and endowment can adjust to alter the rules and structures of transactions, in other words, markets, to privilege power and capital in the first place. Basically, it's silly to presume or assume that those with power and capital are simply price takers. Without an analysis of power and initial endowment, my profession is more than complicit in the continued trajectory towards stratification, both within and across nation state. Indeed, it might not be surprising that there's a paucity of students from subaltern backgrounds studying economics. Ultimately, orthodox explanations of persistent racial disparity or discrimination typically reduced to some collective group-based human capital or cultural ineptitude or dysfunction on the part of blacks themselves or Latinos or other subaltern groups in explaining their worse-off position. My profession has fallen short in the understanding of the role of group identities and how social structures may increase or decrease the value and incentives to invest in that identity. In contrast, stratification economics and critical race theory recognizes that identities are multifaceted and they're not so dichotomous. As such, there are incentives for members of an outgroup to identify with an in-group. In the American context, that would mean the white group, the in-group, and that there are tangible and material psychological benefits of white privilege and the property rights in whiteness. High-achieving black Americans, as measured by education, still exhibit large economic and health disparities relative to their white peers. The fact that blacks who live in families where the head graduated from college typically have less wealth than whites where the household head dropped out of high school, that's an example of the property rights in whiteness. Other examples include Diva Pager's study that demonstrates that white males that signal prior incarceration have greater rates of employment callbacks than black males who signal no prior incarceration. And the fact that black expectant mothers who graduated from college have a greater likelihood of an infant mortality than their white counterparts who dropped out of high school. In terms of economic security, wealth provides both the beginning and the end. It is the primary indicator of economic security. Wealth provides financial agency over one's life. Simply put, wealth gives you choice. It provides the economic security to take risk and shield against financial loss. The top 10% of households hold about 3/4 of the nation's wealth, while the bottom half holds only about 1%. But when it comes to wealth, race is an even stronger predictor than class itself. The 2016 Survey of Consumer Finance indicates that black households would have a median wealth of about $17,600. That's inclusive of home ownership or home equity. In contrast, the figure is $171,000 for white families. The racial wealth gap is an inheritance that begins with chattel slavery, when blacks literally served as the capital assets for a white land-owning plantation class. Much of the framing around wealth disparity, including the use of alternative financial services, focuses on poor financial choices and decision-making on the part of largely black, Latino, and poor borrowers. That's often tied to a culture of poverty thesis regarding some undervalue for and low acquisition of education. Hence, the presumption is that if a greater share of Black and Latinos invested more in a good education, that in turn would lead to better jobs and higher income, then racial disparity would dramatically reduce or ultimately be eliminated altogether. Without a doubt, education is positively associated with better health and economic outcomes for all Americans. However, racial disparity in health and wealth persists and even worsens at higher levels of education. In essence, education is not the antidote for the enormous racial gaps in health and economics. This does not diminish the value of education. There is clear intrinsic value to education along with a public responsibility to expose everyone with a high-quality education that teaches them to synthesize and fuse information into big ideas with encouraging teachers trained to deliver that curriculum from grade school all the way through college. It is a myth that Black families do not value education, but also problematic is the societal overemphasis on the economic returns to education as the panacea to address socially established structural barriers to racial economic inclusion. So let me talk a little about stratification economics. It is an emergent field, subfield in economics. I'm committed to economics. I'm an economist. That's my identity. I'm not shielding that. So I'm talking about ways in which we can expand the boundaries and improve that discipline. It expands the boundaries of how economists analyze intergroup difference. It is an approach that goes beyond individual optimization, infuse insights from multiple social sciences to examine collective group actions and processes. Stratification is a theoretical and empirical approach that challenges the conventional view of human capital attainment and inequality. It again goes beyond individual optimization, and it is a discipline intended to examine identity formation, collective group actions, and how that identity and collective group actions relate to social hierarchy in both economic outcomes and distribution. It recognizes that there are both positive and negative returns to collective group identity, and it's not just material, but cognitive as well. There's psychological benefit and distress that accrue to individuals based on their relative and absolute group position. In other words, whites aren't just concerned about their absolute position, but their relative position along a hierarchy as well. Okay? Likewise, to the extent that individuals have agency in determining or codifying their group-based identity, they will be incentivized to invest in that identity. So it's not something that can't be socially addressed. We can address the returns on identity through social customs and laws. Individual decisions to invest in their identity is similar to a firm's derived demand. As the social value of a group-based identity rises, so will that incentive to invest in that identity. In addition, individual decisions to invest in that identity are also related to how productive they are in translating their efforts into the production of that identity. Likewise, the decision to invest will be related to some cost of the investment. So I've done a lot of work on colorism. Part of the point of the colorism literature is that the proximity of Black people that have more Eurocentric features allows them greater access to invest in the privileges associated with being white. Hence, as the cost of an investment falls and the social value or market price of that group-based identity, like whiteness, rises, so will an individual's incentive to invest in that identity. Stratification economics observes the public good and externality characteristics of collective group identity. Positive and negative rewards associated with collective identity extend regardless of an individual's decision to invest in that identity or not. One member's use of that identity does not necessarily take away from another member's use. So claiming that I'm not a racist does not allow somebody off the hook from the privileges that might be associated with an identity from racist structure. Stratification economics acknowledges that there are positive and negative returns, and they're not just material. I already stated that. Moreover, stratification economics incorporates the concept of cognitive dissonance The psychological discomfort from holding two or more conflicting identities, which at least somewhat constrains individual identity investment decisions towards own group identity and away from out-group identity, even in a social context that offers large material rewards, investment, and other group identity. So in other words, we argue that blacks have agency in choosing their identity. And there might be rewards for rejecting a black identity and adopting a white identity in a society that rewards whiteness. However, that choice to simply abandon a black identity is not without constraints. Cognitive dissonance is one big constraint. That's the point. All right. Let me move on. Let me do a little more on stratification economics, then I'll move on. Okay. So it differs from orthodox economics in the presumption that there's an irrationality of discrimination stemming largely from the view that the out-group identity is predetermined exogenous trait. So a lot of economics has the presumption that bigotry is based on taste and preferences, and that people might be willing to pay for that taste and preference of bigotry by hiring less productive workers than they otherwise would and paying a high cost for it. Well, stratification economics argues that it's not an irrational trait associated with bigotry alone, but rather it is strategic, that it has a functional role. And it is, ironically, the presumption of rationality that better enables stratification economics to explain persistent group inequality and understand how markets themselves may be exploited to actually reinforce inequality rather than discipline bigots and bid them out of the market. With stratification economics, race prejudice constitutes a defensive reaction. It is a protective mechanism that serves the function of preserving social hierarchy and enhancing relative group position of the dominant group. A lot of this comes from Herbert Blummer in sociology, if there's sociologists in the room. Okay. So the Nobel laureate Sir Arthur Lewis, in his book Racial Conflict in Economics, describes how a dominant group maintains their social hierarchical positioning by rendering the subaltern or black group as non-competing. The theory explains that in the pre-market stage, when individuals acquire skills and credentials to compete in the market, the dominant group tends to use their power to limit subaltern groups' access to the skills and credentials, right? So as to render them non-competing when they get to the market stage. So Lewis describes two strategies used by the dominant group when members from the subaltern group are able to overcome these pre-market barriers and become competitive. So one way is to render them non-competing, but when they become competitive, the first is to change the credentialing criteria in the market stage so as to favor their own attributes. Basically change the rules in the middle of the game. The second is simply to discriminate against the competing group members of the subaltern group. So we argue that discrimination has a function or a purpose similar to what Lewis describes, that when groups become competitive, they will face greater discrimination. And that fits in with what I'm talking about, the role of education and race and some market outcomes. It is when blacks become more competitive, we expect that there will be a greater backlash in response in terms of some structural barriers so as to maintain social hierarchy. All right, so let me pivot back to some health outcomes. And to do so, let me give some more context. Midway through his 2013 commencement address at Morehouse College, President Barack Obama invoked the Black American legacy of triumphant leaders who, without excuses, were able to overcome tremendous structural barriers and achieve great things. So he says, quote, actually I can put it up. There we go. He says, quote, "You now hail from a lineage and legacy of immeasurably strong men, men who bore tremendous burdens and still laid the stones for the path on which we now walk. You wear the mantle of Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington," I'm going to say et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. "And yes, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., these men were many things to many people, and they knew full well the role that racism played in their lives. But when it comes to their own accomplishments and sense of purpose, they had no time for excuses." So the president continues this speech to the graduating class at an elite historically black college and university by stating, every one of you have a grandma or an uncle or a parent who's told you at some time in life as an African American, you have to work twice as hard as anyone else if you want to get by, right? So many have heard this in this room. I'm not giving somebody a narrative. You don't have to be black to have heard that narrative. We've heard that narrative, okay? But the question we should ask, at least from a structural point, not an individual advice-giving point, but something that the president might be concerned with, at what cost? Are there economic and health consequences associated with above normal effort for these highly educated, racially stigmatized black graduates in a context of a racially stratified America? The emerging consensus that the social determinants is that there's social determinants of health. The World Health Organization defines as the conditions in which individuals are born, grow, live, work, and age. These are the primary determinants of health and likewise health disparity. That's the consensus, that there's social determinants of health. Hence, the presumption is, again, that if a greater share of black and Latinos invested in their education, better jobs, that health disparity would dramatically be reduced or eliminated. Again, education is positively associated with better health for all Americans. However, the evidence is clear that the disparities still persist with education. I'm going to leave this up while I talk so you can see some of these disparities. I won't go through them, but I'll just leave the slide up. Right, so this is not consistent. The statistic I gave you earlier about black expectant mothers and they having higher infant mortality rates than white mothers, expectant mothers who dropped out of high school. We know that that's not consistent with the social determinants of health model. Right, so the social determinant model that proxies individual self-investment and agency with education as the explanation for health disparity, the most educated black expectant mothers have worse outcomes than that of white mothers. The pattern of disparity is not limited to infant mortality, as you can see. Racial mortality persists across many major diseases, including cancer, heart disease, stroke, HIV-related causes, and disturbingly, and perhaps more alarmingly, these disparities oftentimes rise at higher levels of educational attainment. There are physical and psychological costs of stigma and ironically exerting individual agency, working twice as hard to get by. That might explain the limited role of education and income as protective health factors for blacks relative to whites. The added efforts and stigma imposed on high-achieving blacks that threaten the relative position of the dominant white group may translate into deleterious health and economic outcomes for high-achieving black Americans. The public health scholar Sherman James, who's I think he's still at Emory. No? Okay, he was at Emory at one point. He hypothesized that a strong behavioral predisposition to cope actively with psychosocial environmental stressors interact with low socioeconomic status to influence the health of African Americans. He labeled this theory John Henryism after the fable of the hammer-wielding black railroad worker who emerged victorious against a tunnel-digging machine in a race that's classically considered the man-over-machine metaphor. But the course in that John Henry fable, he collapsed to his death from heart disease at the end. The John Henryism theory explains low socioeconomic status blacks are chronically exposed to psychosocial stress via the threat of job loss and trying to make ends meet, social insults linked to race and class, and thus are required to exert considerable energy on a daily basis to cope with conditions of high anxiety and uncertainty. This unfortunate irony is that blacks who put forth the highest effort to cope with their difficult circumstances are the ones at the greatest risk of negative health consequences, e.g. high blood pressure, John Henryism may be extended to demonstrate that as socioeconomic status rises, so does the level of stress faced by the high-achieving blacks relative to their white peers. The prevalence of a neoliberal and post-racial thought, both framed in the politics of personal responsibility, they all emphasize individual agency, particularly self-investment in education, are the pathways towards upward mobility and an efficient social distribution. Well, that narrative and norm might literally be bad for black people's health. Essentially, the tragic irony is that the political rhetoric that emphasizes hard work, individual agency, and personal responsibility may enhance harmful social stigma that imposes physical and psychological health costs on socially stigmatized population. Similar to health economics or health outcomes, there's a pattern of persistent or worsening racial disparity in economic outcomes with increases in education. Nonetheless, the political discourse upheld by Democrats, Republicans, blacks, and whites alike emphasize education, motivation, and personal responsibility on the part of blacks as the explanation for the racial divide. This follows from the perspective where the free market, as long as individual agents are properly incentivized, it's supposed to be the solution for all our problems, economic or otherwise. The political scientists Joe Sauce, Richard Fording, and Sanford Schramm, in their seminal book entitled Disciplining the Poor, describes this, what they characterize as a neoliberal paternalism, where the state serves the paradoxical role of structuring most aspects of society to adhere to a laissez-faire market tenet, while at the same time serving the role of poverty governance for poor people. Here the state uses incentives and sanctions to coerce or discipline the underclass, not working to eliminate poverty, but rather to manage seemingly bad behavior with increasingly punitive tactics. Stigmatization on race becomes the political fodder to implement harsh and punitive controls of the underclass. Because of their marginalized social status and overrepresentation in poverty, blacks become the symbolism by which this surplus population is characterized as persistently unemployed, unemployable, a source of urban malice, crime, and whose subsistence needs are deemed a drain on local fiscal budgets. This neoliberal paternalistic frame provides the rationale for austerity policy. If behavioral modification, particularly with regards to personal and human capital investment, is the central theme or idea, why fund government agencies and programs which at best misallocate resources to irresponsible individuals and at worst create dependencies that further fuel irresponsible behavior? Examples of this neoliberal policy and control mechanisms to manage surplus populations, they include things like income maintenance programs. Again, not trying to eliminate poverty, but rather manage it with subsistence. Social isolation, basically segregation. Mass incarceration. Policies aimed at controlling reproduction, fertility, and family formation. And then finally, social experimentation on the poor, including the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiment. That would be one extreme. One could look to moving to opportunities as perhaps a more benign approach, but again, we socially experiment on poor and marginalized populations. The cruel irony is that the post-racial politics of personal responsibility and neoliberal paternalistic tropes, which all emphasize no excuses, grit, hard work, as I stated earlier, they may actually exacerbate economic and health disparities, particularly for those that pose a competitive threat to the preferred position of the socially dominant group. Okay. All right, so stratification economics looks beyond individual factors to investigate structural and contextual factors that, again, preserve the relative status of the dominant group via intergenerational transfers and other exclusionary practice to explain intergroup disparity. So I'm going to list 10 bold policies that I think could bring about what Amartya Sen might characterize as a society that emphasizes human capabilities and greater economic empowerment for all. And then I'll go more in depth on two, which would be the federal job guarantee and baby bonds. But here are the 10 policies, if I could find them. Did I go too far? I did. There we go. All right. So a 10-point plan could include, I start with reparations. Reparations for slavery, Jim Crow, and exclusion from New Deal and post-war policies. The purpose would be to get beyond our race problem. In order to do so, we need to first acknowledge, then we need to redress the legacies of racial discrimination, and then there's responsibility for blacks as well. If we properly redress it, then that problem is addressed. We move on. Doesn't mean that we stop enforcing anti-discrimination, but our claims on the past that are material, if they're properly redressed, that would be part of the bargain. We move on. 2, baby bonds. The program is analogous to a Social Security program for young adults to provide capital finance as they begin a lifetime of building assets and economic security, independent of the financial positioning and decision-making of the families in which they're born. We have policies designed for people in the twilight of their life, but nothing when they're young adults, when actually wealth disparity starts to dramatically manifest, okay? 3rd, federal job guarantee. It offers the economic security of a living wage to all citizens. It provides investment into our public physical and human infrastructure, and it provides an implicit floor on wages and other worker amenities. It provides jobs for socially stigmatized workers and increases the bargaining power for all workers by removing the threat of unemployment. 4th, a federalized credit score system. A metric so determinate on individual life chances should not be left to the private sector. It should be transparent, and it should have the accountability that goes along with being an elected official. 5th, postal banking. To provide banking services, short and long-term loans, particularly for unprivileged individuals who financially have to rely on predatory check cashing, as well as payday lenders. Basically, it would put a floor on the financial products that would be available to all Americans. 6, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission should conduct employment audits to detect racial discrimination and prosecute discriminating firms. We should be proactive in detecting discrimination, particularly for firms that receive federal funds. Okay. Number 7, federal subsidy to HBCUs to the tune of the present value of the support reached by other colleges and universities from post-World War II GI Bill. It's evident that blacks still need stereotype-safe environments that mitigate hostility and provide curriculum more relevant to their experiences than they would get otherwise. Number 8, we should eliminate tracking in grade school altogether and instead offer universal and talented gifted curriculum to everyone. Number 9, single-payer health insurance, as well as tuition-free public universities. We should remove the threat and stigma associated with trying to finance a product that we deem universal for all at the point of delivery of that service. Okay. Number...
Incarceration.
I skipped 9.
You went to health insurance, which is 10.
My list is different than the one I have up there. But we need to stop mass incarceration. Actually, stop mass incarceration, particularly for nonviolent offenders, hold police criminally and civilly responsible for abusive practice, and a line that typically goes well on college campuses, legalize marijuana. Okay. All right, so if I have a little bit of time, I'll talk more about baby bonds and federal job guarantee, which are policies that, they've been getting a lot of attention lately. There are multiple members of Congress, including senators, that have inquired about these policies. I'll say that. Okay. William Darrick and I advocate for baby bonds. Basically, that's a child trust account set up at birth. They're not literally bonds. We use that for alliteration and political purposes to address the enormous racial wealth gap. Baby bonds are designed to provide an opportunity to purchase an appreciating asset for all newborns. The program is analogous to Social Security. The program would provide capital finance for young adults to begin a lifetime of building assets and economic security, independent of the position that they're born into, as well as any decision-making of the families that they're born into. Some people say baby bonds, pejoratively, are like child savings accounts on steroids. They're not. They're not savings accounts. They're intended, again, to shield children from whatever family they're born into, positively or negatively. The program would be universal, but the amount of the account would be graduated based on the child's parental wealth. We envision endowing American newborns with an average account of $20,000 that would gradationally rise upwards to $60,000 for babies born into the most wealth-poor families. The accounts would be federally managed and grow at a guaranteed annual interest rate of 1.5% to 2%. The account could be accessed when the child becomes an adult and used for some asset-enhancing endeavor, such as purchasing a home, starting a new business, or financing a debt-free college education. Baby bonds could be fully funded simply by a more equitable distribution of what the federal government already spends on asset-enhancing programs. In excess of $500 billion of the federal budget in the form of tax subsidies and savings on things like mortgage interest deductions, reduced rates on tax on dividends, and long-term capital gains, as well as exclusion of capital gains at death, are all used to promote asset building in the country. The problem is not the amount of that budget, but the allocation. More than half of these benefits go to the top 5% of earners, while the bottom 60% of earners receive only about 5% of that allocation. With approximately 4 million babies born each year, if the average endowment of a baby bond is set at $20,000, the program would crudely cost about $80 to $90 billion per year. This would constitute about 2% of the federal budget, and it is far less than the $500 billion that we already spend on asset promotion. Okay? A federal job guarantee, right? So it would be administered by what we're characterizing as a National Investment Employment Corp. It would eliminate working poverty altogether. It would eliminate involuntary unemployment altogether. It would provide a public option of employment to better enable workers to bargain for decent wages and working conditions. And four, as I've stated before, it would eliminate the threat of unemployment for all workers. As a tenured professor, I don't have the threat of unemployment that other workers have, and that's powerful. I can stand before you and advocate for a federal job guarantee without fear of losing my job. We know in this country that job openings have never exceeded the number of job seekers, even in prosperity. We know that homeless individuals, about nearly half, over 40% of homeless individuals actually have a job. We know that there's a whole lot of people that make below $15 an hour. Nearly half of the US workforce, about 43%, earns $15 or below. And that doesn't account for the number of children that are living in working poverty. We know that the nature of work is becoming more contingent, with less security, less stability. A federal job guarantee would be counter-cyclical. So it would expand in times of economic crises, and it would reduce in times of economic progress. It would address structural unemployment altogether. The political framing. Again, we emphasize economic austerity and growth. Workers are vulnerable to the fickle contingency of trickle-down job creation. So we try to cajole and incentivize firms with tax incentives to produce more jobs. One problem with that is, well, there are two problems. One is there's no guarantee that public infrastructure is actually built. The jobs might be substitutes. They might not be permanent. And then the other part is it becomes a divestment of our public infrastructure that we all need access to. Okay? So not only would a federal job guarantee provide a direct source of employment, it would enable all workers, particularly those at the low end, to bargain for better wages, better benefits, without the fear of being destitute from unemployment. So it empowers all workers, not just the direct recipients. The Economic Bill of Rights Roosevelt believed in, he argued that the American Revolution was incomplete and that a new set of rights were needed, economic rights. The first article of his Economic Bill of Rights, the first article in his proposed second Bill of Economic Rights was the right to employment. He argued, quote, physical security, economic security, social security, and moral security as a universal rights. These ideals are also within the realm of what the Reverend William Barber now describes as economic justice being a moral imperative. The federal job guarantee would provide Americans an authentic right to work. The program would structurally change the U.S. economy away from low-wage work, a sector in which the expanding global economy is making us increasingly less competitive anyway, towards more moderate and high-wage jobs. So when people say, won't this program compete away low-wage jobs or address people working in low-wage sector, we argue that's a feature, not a flaw of the program. We're trying to eliminate low-wage jobs altogether. Ensuring that the U.S. lives up to the unfunded mandate to achieve and maintain full employment that was outlined in the 1978 Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act. Basically, the act is an unfunded mandate. The federal government, states, Indian nations, and local municipalities, they would basically conduct inventories of their needs and develop a job bank of tasks to be performed. Priority would be given to the most urgent projects to aid the most distressed communities. The work done by employees in the National Investment Employee Corp would address the nation's 21st century infrastructure needs. The federal job guarantee program could invest in building more sustainable and resilient localities. We could again prioritize transitions to a green economy, not just in the US, but the entire world. Provisions for human infrastructure investments would also be included in this 21st century economic package. That would include high quality, universal, pre-kindergarten education, child care, adult care, elder care. Some care workers would be provided with trainings to deliver special services to special need communities. The current exorbitant cost of child care is a major obstacle for parents, restricting their access to the labor market and greatly exacerbating inequality and access and opportunity for children in general. While our proposal is facially gender neutral, it is gender conscious, since basic elements of the program would disproportionately benefit women who have to carry greater care burden. So it would professionalize care work in general by offering the dignity of wages and benefits. But on the other hand, it would free up women or whoever's doing this work to pursue other activities in the labor market because there would be a professionalized labor force to do it. There would be a wide array of cost savings from other social programs. They basically could be eliminated or reduced dramatically. It would restore tax bases to state and municipal levels, alleviating their current budget crises. The medical coverage provided as a job benefit for the federal job guarantee would allow for an implicit public option, not only to health care, but to minimum wage and other worker amenities. In addition, the federal job guarantee program would mitigate personal and familial costs of damaged mental health and other stressors that are often faced by the unemployed. I'll summarize the 12 points of the federal job guarantee and stop. 1, it would dramatically raise worker bargaining power by removing that threat of unemployment. 2, it would reduce the need for minimum wage laws. We would have an implicit minimum wage. It would also provide an implicit health care option, and it would discipline employment in general by using worker benefits as a way to, if an employer wanted to compete for workers, they would at least have to offer that. It would improve working conditions, mental health benefits, reduce the adverse effects of job discrimination to stigmatized populations. So if you were formerly incarcerated and paid your debt to society, you would have access to a job. It would improve our physical and human capital infrastructure, which ultimately would provide for a better economy in general. It would stimulate aggregate demand. It would provide an automatic stabilizer when we have economic downturns. It would be a direct source of jobs. It would eliminate the moral hazard problem associated with the promise of bailout to the financial sector in times of economic crisis. In other words, if we have provisions for Main Street, there would be no need to bail out Wall Street as a result of their, I didn't say that, somebody else said it. I will conclude by basically saying it's a bold policy that would transform the U.S. economy away from low-wage work to moderate high-wage work by also providing economic security to all workers. So I'll stop there.